Dr. Susan Tierney. She's a senior advisor at Analysis Group and an expert on energy economics, regulation, policy, particularly in the electric and natural gas industries. And as a consultant, she's consulted to business and governments and others on economic and environmental regulation and strategy. And she's been a member of numerous National Academies panels on electricity and climate issues. She's a former Massachusetts state regulator, former Assistant Secretary for Policy of the U.S. Department of Energy, and she's currently chair of RFF's board of directors, Dick having been the past chair of RFF's board of directors, and she's also vice chair of WRI's board of directors. So I often kid with Sue that she is definitely more than one person. But anyway, she's going to be talking today about her paper, which is titled Wholesale Power Market Design in a Future Low Carbon Electric System. So Sue, please take it away. Oh, and let me just say, we have 25 minutes of talk, and then we're going to have 25 minutes for Sue to present her ideas, and then 20 minutes of discussion. And so be ready with your questions, and you can put them in chat, or we'll be taking hand raises.
So thank you for the nice introduction, Karen. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, you're good.
I cannot see you because this is full screen, so you're I have to trust that. It is really delightful to follow upon Dick's presentation, just as I followed up in his very, very big shoes in a small way as chair of the RFF board. It's especially nice to follow Dick and Peter because I think some of the points that they have made are things that are reflected in my own thoughts about a future power market design. So I'm going to go through that. I know you have the full paper. This presentation is longer than it should be, and therefore I'm not going to say every word, but I have to be honest, I prepared the presentation assuming that it will be posted on the web at some point, and therefore I wanted it to be a standalone document. So let me quickly go to the starting point for me, and this is not in my paper. This Karen will probably recognize this picture because it's something that we've been discussing in our Academies Committee on the future of the grid. And the reason I wanted to put this, iconography about system architecture is that this really affects how I think one has to think about this system. This is a system that has unbelievable, real, important, essential physical infrastructure elements. And so I can't divorce my thoughts about how the system should be priced and regulated without knowing that that physical aspect of the system is on the top layer of everything. I'm not going to spend any time on the second layer, which is really all of the detailed communications, information technology controls that make it work and that connect different parts of the system to each other. But I am going to talk more about the things in the bottom layer. And these are all the complicated things that we've just been talking about, the rules of engagement, the institutions, who makes decisions about what kind of money is going to be made in this system, who makes decisions about the policy goals and objectives and so forth. So to me, that infrastructure, that architecture affects how I think about this problem. So I have listed a bunch of assumptions here because they too affect how I think about this. And the only takeaway here is to say, I really do think markets are marvelous to the extent that they can be operated within a number of constraints that live in the real world. Dick just mentioned some of them, the fact that regulators and politicians cannot resist the impulse to intervene. So I think markets are a tool, a very, very essential tool, but they can't do it all. And therefore, I think there's a really important role of policy, and that is a policy that has to be driven at the state and subnational level and with private actors, because we can't assume that in the real world that we live in, that there is going to be a national government policy that really puts into effect a unifying economy-wide carbon pricing regime. That's just not happening anytime soon. So we have to think about other approaches. And then finally, I want to underscore the point that Peter made, and that is that this system, if we're talking about a decarbonized economy, this system is going to be much bigger, much more reliant upon electricity supply for heating, for not just for lights, for heating, for industrial uses, for moving vehicles around the system. And therefore, people are going to count on a reliable electric system for everything. And so reliability has a premium here, in my point, my way of looking at things. The top line here is that I'm using the phrase resource adequacy in my presentation in a very different way that is additive to today's definition. I'm going to come back to this later, but it really means that resource adequacy is making sure you've got an adequate resources around the clock, not just on that peak moment. And then the second point I want to make here is that the kinds of portfolios of resources that we're going to need going forward that provide a balancing of adequate services, cost minimization, all of the functionalities that we need, and low carbon is not going to be produced by auctions alone that really just reflect price. I'm sure that's very controversial amongst this crowd, but we're not going to have a price on carbon that will enable that pricing mechanism to accomplish all the other objectives. I want to make sure that you understand that I understand the regional wholesale power markets have been very beneficial in this country. They have provided billions of dollars to save in savings to consumers. They have brought an enormous amount of investment into the to enter the market. That is all very, very good. But I focus in particular on my comments on the 3 RTOs with centralized capacity markets because they face challenges in terms of producing the kind of resource mix that is matching up with the efficiency and reliability outcomes that people hope for the electric system, but also the lower carbon outcomes that the states and many consumers and private parties in those regions want to see produced from the electricity market. And so I think that there's a stressful situation, to say the least, in those RTOs, and that without a truly meaningful price on carbon inside those markets and outside the economy, the revenues in those markets are not going to be high enough to compensate suppliers of zero carbon energy resources, nor are they going to be sufficient to accelerate the entry of the kinds of resources that need to be in place on a pace that is consistent with the state's energy and climate goals. So just a reminder here, I know you know this, but half of the electricity sold in the United States is in the lower 48, occurs in a state with a greenhouse gas reduction commitment. And most of these commitments are binding. 80% of investor-owned utilities have committed to greenhouse gas reduction commitments, typically in the form of net zero carbon by 2050. So that covers an enormous amount of the United States, including in the white space on the map above this. And then third, there's a lot of overlap with these organized RTO and ISO footprints for sure. I'm going to focus on a couple of regions. Certainly the mid-Atlantic to Northeast region, where everybody, just about everybody, has a carbon commitment in terms of the states in that footprint. And then similarly in the MISO footprint, because they represent 2 different types of approaches to the regional markets. Now, in so doing, let's see, I think there's a whole bunch of things here about what the conditions are going to be like in those 3 organized RTOs with centralized capacity markets. I'm not going to talk about these because we've talked about these for the last months and years, and Paul certainly talked about them. But I am going to talk about in the other RTOs besides PJM New York and ISO New England, there's a commonality, and that is that the states have a much more direct role in driving resource portfolio. That must sound weird to the folks who are advocates of the ERCOT model, but give me a moment to explain. So clearly the states in MISO, SPP, California where there are vertically integrated utilities, there's a combination of tools: long-term resource planning, utility and non-utility project proposals and investments, competitive resource procurements, long-term contracting, and a variety of things to arrive at the portfolio of resources that satisfy state, consumer, and utility and investor preferences. And in Texas, even though it is a very, very, kind of free marketeer approach, there are elements of the combination of things in that wholesale market design that really are state governed, state driven in one way or another. The state singularly has jurisdiction over the combination of retail competition and how retail competition is structured there, that it is mandatory. That's not the case anywhere else. And that was a state decision, and the state continues to adhere and support that. The state continues to adhere to and support the energy only wholesale market design with a lot of scarcity pricing reliance, as Dick described. That combination is important for creating the incentives for bilateral contracting. And really importantly, Texas used a socialist approach to transmission planning and cost allocation to build out the CREZ system in anticipation of attracting investment, private investment in renewable development. So it's a really interesting combination, but it's clearly state driven. So in the other RTOs, such as Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, let's just say PJM to New England, there you have to think about if the states really are serious about meeting their greenhouse gas commitments, then they have to have more influence over the RTO policy, again, in the absence of a meaningful federal carbon price that would cut across the states. And so that means that the RTO market design has to do something that reflects not only efficiency and reliability, but also the carbon rules and carbon preferences that come to play. Some RTOs may reflect state intentions and hopes for carbon reduction through a carbon pricing mechanism, such as has been developed in New York. And that would affect how things roll out in energy markets, but it would affect, of course, pricing in capacity markets as well. In those states, in order to do that, FERC would need to recognize the aspirations of a state. My view is if FERC were to receive a proposal from New York, it would and approve it, it would have to be recognizing state influence, just as FERC already does that in MISO, SPP, and the California ISO. More RTOs, in my opinion, may end up evolving toward the MISO, CAISO, and SPP model with very efficient dispatch in short-term markets and a larger voice for states' actions, state preferences, state policies, state decisions in resource portfolios. And then finally, do I think that others will export the ERCOT model? No, I don't. It would really surprise me if a number of other states would adopt it and sustain its embrace for lots of different reasons. I can go through those in questions and answers if you'd like to see, but it's probably obvious from the way I've been talking so far. And I think the jury is actually still out about how it's going to work for a world that is dominated by zero emitting resources. Right now, it's only a third of supply. So those assumptions really affect my proposal. I really appreciate the reviewers' comments that were very thoughtful. They spent a lot of time reviewing my paper. I really appreciate it. I didn't agree with everybody. Ironically, some people thought I was anti-market and ignored ERCOT's success, while others thought I put too much faith in the market. So just, in my old regulators adage, I guess I made everybody unhappy. So maybe it's like just Goldilocks, okay, who knows? So my three building blocks represent a market design that I'm sure makes some of the RTOs shudder. In other words, any participants on this call that are from PJM, New York, and New England, I just apologize in advance. I'm sure this is making you cringe. And I'm sure this makes the people who love ERCOT cringe, but I already explained why I didn't pass along that approach to these other regions. Ironically, I think that my approach has a big role for RTOs. And so I would just encourage some openness from RTOs as they listen to this about why I think this might be an interesting model for them, even if it's different than the one that's in place today. So there are three core building blocks. There, you can see them there. A wholesale energy and ancillary service market that we know and love today, a resource adequacy approach that's really different than what we've got today. I'll go through that. And then something that's really outside the market, and that is price responsive demand coming from state drivers to ensure that that can happen, and that demand can robustly participate in the wholesale market. Now, in retrospect, I really wish that I had added a fourth building block. Rob Gramlich and I had a sidebar conversation about my paper, and I really do think that I should have spent more time on a fourth building block. I think that, that we are really challenged on transmission everywhere around the United States, and I'll say why I say that in the context of a decarbonized energy system. But I think that we might need to look more with open arms to the approach that Texas took. So here's why I say that. I think that we have actually built a lot of transmission, made a lot of transmission investment in the last 15 years, surprisingly, since, say, the Energy Policy Act of 2005. And there's been a lot of transmission planning. We have identified places where there would be reliability violations, and where such violations have been found and demonstrated to occur, we see approvals coming for building transmission. States pretty much salute, I mean, they go through rigorous siting reviews, but they by and large approve reliability driven transmission. I think the jury is much more mixed when there are proposals for power transmission enhancements that are designed to relieve transmission congestion. So I'll call those economically driven new power lines or enhancements, where you really can't rest your laurels on the reliability argument. Very, very difficult to get through the siting reviews in states, especially where the state in the middle of places where there are congestion constraints and relief, where that state doesn't think there are enough benefits. So that one's challenging, to be sure. But where we really are fundamentally broken, I think, is in a place where we are needing transmission to accommodate and amplify and encourage and support policy driven outcomes, especially now related to zero emitting resources. I mean, you just think about what happened to the Clean Line Energy Project, and we just couldn't find a way to open up transmission for the rich resources in the prairies and make them available to demand centers using today's model. So I think transmission is a key element of this, and I wish I had talked more about it. So first building block, I don't need to talk about this. It's the world as we know it today in terms of security constrained, dispatch, locational prices, and so forth. I'm assuming scarcity pricing will occur here. Carbon pricing mechanisms into those markets. I think that there should be openness by FERC to receive proposals under current jurisdiction of FERC to allow for state preferences to have a tariff that includes a carbon pricing mechanism. And I can picture that not only just in a single state place like NYISO, but also in a place like PJM, where some states would put such carbon pricing mechanisms in place. And the tariff would accommodate that and allow for the algorithms for dispatch and settlement to accommodate those state policies. I would expect a lot of price variation across locations and over time. Dick talked about these with respect to what's happening in Hawaii and in Texas. So I would expect to see a lot of spikes. I would expect to see a lot of zero prices, and I would expect to see some negative prices as well. So let me spend more time talking about the resource adequacy approach. And I told you a few minutes ago that I rely on a very different definition of resource adequacy. It goes beyond today's definition that covers peak and reserve requirements. There are two other elements that I would add, and these are A, the types of resources that need to be located in particular constrained areas in order to keep the lights on. And then secondly, the types of preferred attributes of resources that are needed. And this might be flexible attributes in order to make sure that there's enough flexible supply on the system above and beyond what the ancillary services markets and products might bring forward. And that there are increasing quantities of zero carbon capacity. And that would be enabling, as Dick said, in Hawaii, were it to have a market design like this, that would be capacity that then could provide the zero carbon energy and ancillary services that are needed for the market. So resource adequacy is adequate resources in the time, place, and attributes that are needed for the system to maintain the system as a whole and meet not only the reliability, efficiency, as well as low carbon requirements. So I already talked about that. That ends up for me and producing three types of products in the resource adequacy market. The system resource adequacy is more like the type that we know today, meeting the peak and reserve requirements, but I would add this overlay of the system needs for some amount of types of attributes of zero carbon capacity. Then flexible resources, as I mentioned, that can provide ramping and other balancing services. And then local resources that may be needed in particular places. And I assume that in a place where there is, let's say, full build out of the transmission grid, you wouldn't have any local RA requirement because pretty much there are no load constrained pockets. So the second part of my research, my proposal here is that FERC would have an approved tariff that would anticipate and reflect states' requirements. Now, Carl and I talked about whether I was really talking about preferences. No, I'm really talking about requirements. So that's why I've crossed out the word preferences, and you can read every time I leave preferences on my slides, I really mean it as requirements. So the tariff would allow each state to identify what it requires for the resources in its states. And these are resources that in effect are those that at a minimum would be able to supply equivalent amounts of capacity to satisfy the the LSE obligations in that state with regard to low carbon supply or renewable supply or whatever it is. So that in the procurements that the RTO would administer, the state would say, I need this amount of capacity to look like X, Y, and Z in these years. So the states would identify the attributes, and those would be part of the specifications for the procurements. And the states could have a carve out. Let's say commercial offshore wind, commercially ready offshore wind is way above market. The state could say, I want that still to be part of the procurement equivalent to my LSE's needs. A state could say, I have a lot of coal in my state. I want to have carbon capture and utilization capacity in my procurement So in very distant years, you got to start procuring some amount of that emerging technology equivalent to my need.
2-minute warning.
Thank you. Okay. The state would do long-term planning, and they would look at all sorts of things, what's on the system today, what types of transmission enhancements are needed, the carbon emission trajectories of the states and the LSE requirements for those. And the resource plan would identify the types of capacity above and beyond what the LSEs and through their states are saying they need, but also that the RTO would plan for and procure through its long-term procurements. There would be procurements that would identify specifications for each of these different types of RA needs. If there are any RA needs, they would identify the places and the amounts and the timeframes for those. Same would be true for flexibility that would be across the system. The RTO would be the central procurer of those. Then for system, anything that the system needs above and beyond what would have already been met by local and flexible RA cumulatively, then that would go out with a system procurement. Now, the way that that would happen is that there would again be long-term procurements, LSEs that are long on their resources could offer into those system RA, but if they hold local resources and flexible resources and they want them counted, they must bid those into the market just as suppliers would do on their own. So the RA would fill out and identify the resources that would satisfy the procurement. There would be much more requirement to fill that out in the near-term years as compared to the long-term years. And there would be reconfiguration procurements to make sure that things were settling out over time. I'm almost done.
Yeah, so if you could take a couple minutes to make sure you get through your slides. This is great.
Yeah, I'm totally almost done. So the offers would reflect the supplier's view about when their resource would be ready for the market. So they could say this is ready 1 year forward, or it can come into play the 5th year, then forward, et cetera. And their prices would reflect the dollar per megawatt requirement, and they would identify delivery spots and so forth. The RTO, let's see if I need to talk about this. No. Same would be true for the system RA. The offers would be voluntary in this market. A LSE could meet its own obligations in system RA with bilateral contracts that reflect its own preference for the portfolio that's already there. And then they could go to the system RA market to obtain any additional ones. And as I said, if they're long on system RA, they can put that into the market as well. The RTO would identify the best fit cost minimized combination of resources. They would select first RA requirement that would count towards any flexible and system RA to the extent that it would actually provide those capabilities. Then the RTO would select flexible RA, and again, that would count towards system RA, and then the RTO would identify and then contract with remaining system RA products that needed to be obtained. There would be long-term performance-based contracts. These would be dollar per megawatt contracts with costs assigned to the relevant load-serving entities. Let's see, outside of the tariff, so assume all sorts of retail resources on the demand side could participate in those markets on a non-discriminatory basis. But the states would need to open up and make sure that transparent prices were able to be seen by retail consumers. And then you would imagine that aggregators would be available either through utilities or third parties to pull together different retail customers' loads and offer those into wholesale markets. Of course, retail customers could do that on their own to the extent that they're sophisticated enough to do so. Then finally, here's my last slide. How would the wholesale market address greenhouse gas emissions? First, by assuming that if there were state, federal and regional carbon pricing mechanisms like we have today for RGGI, and may have in a larger footprint in the in the future, those would show up in the price formation in the RTO's energy and ancillary service markets. Second, the FERC tariff for resource adequacy would acknowledge the ability of states to adopt a carbon pricing mechanism. I guess that's not resource adequacy, sorry. That would affect the RTO energy market. Second, the states could nominate and direct the RTO to procure the types of attributes for capacity resources that would be procured through the through the RTO products. I could imagine even further that a state would say, I have this carbon emission reduction budget, and therefore the RTO's energy market has to reflect that reduced amount of emissions in the footprint of my state over time, so that that could be another way that carbon emissions would be reflected in all of this. That's it. I do have to thank the team for the wonderful work they've done to put this together, to invite me to participate and to host this meeting. And with that, I apologize for going over.